On the morning of the 6th of July, 1809, the most dangerous part of Napoleon's position was not where he had planned to win the battle. It was on his left. Austrian troops were pressing back toward Aspern and Essling, the same villages around which the French army had fought and failed only 6 weeks earlier. Farther north, Aderklaa had become a confused struggle of infantry, artillery, and cavalry. On the far left, Johann von Klenau's corps was moving toward the French rear. If that movement continued, the roads and bridges leading back to Lobau could come under pressure. Napoleon had crossed the Danube with a much stronger system than before, but that system still ended on an island behind his army. For several hours, the possibility existed that the French would be forced to fight their way back toward the ground of their previous defeat. 6 weeks earlier at Aspern-Essling, the problem had been much simpler to identify. Austria had opened the war in April, hoping to regain the initiative, while Napoleon was heavily committed in Spain. The French response drove the main Austrian army back and cost the Habsburg monarchy Vienna. But Charles still commanded the force that mattered most. As long as his army remained intact north of the Danube, occupying the capital did not end the war. Napoleon had crossed the Danube before his bridge system could reliably support the army already fighting on the north bank. Austrian attacks and repeated damage to the bridges interrupted the movement of ammunition, reinforcements, and artillery. The French held Aspern and Essling through repeated assaults, but the position became increasingly difficult to sustain. Marshal Lannes was mortally wounded. By May 22, Napoleon had no practical choice but to withdraw his army to Lobau. Archduke Charles had done what few commanders had managed before him. He had stopped Napoleon in a major battle, but he had not destroyed the French army. That distinction mattered. The surviving French troops were still concentrated around Lobau. Vienna remained in Napoleon's hands, giving him access to supplies and arsenals. Charles had won the battlefield, but Napoleon retained the means to prepare another attempt. During the next 6 weeks, Lobau changed from a refuge into an operational base. Stronger bridges were built from the southern bank. Additional bridges and landing points were prepared for the next crossing. French engineers improved protection against floating obstacles and Austrian attempts to damage the bridges. Artillery was placed on the island, supplies were accumulated, and troops were brought into position. Napoleon also encouraged Charles to believe that the next crossing might again be directed toward Aspern and Essling. The real attack would come farther east. Late on the 4th of July, during a violent storm, the French movement began. Infantry crossed first from the eastern side of Lobau. Engineers opened more passages as the leading formations secured the northern bank. Artillery followed over the new bridges. Oudinot, Massena, and elements of Devout's corps moved onto the Marchfeld while more formations waited behind them. By the morning of the 5th of July, the French had already established a broad bridgehead, and the flow of troops continued. This time the Danube did not stop Napoleon. Charles had prepared the approaches around Aspern, Essling, and Enzersdorf, expecting the French to repeat much of their earlier operation. Once the actual direction became clear, he withdrew the main army toward the higher ground along the Russbach. That decision preserved his army for the battle that was now developing north of Lobau as the French deployed. Their line curved across the open Marchfeld. Mastina covered the left, with the Danube and the old battlefield behind him. Oudinot occupied the center. Right, Devout formed on the far right. Behind and between them came the army of Italy under Hugues de Beauharnais, Bernadotte's Saxons, Marmont's corps, cavalry reserves, and the Imperial Guard. Ahead stood the Austrian army, arranged around a chain of villages in the Russbach position. Wagram lay near the center. Aderklaa stood farther west. Bommersdorf and Markgraf Neusiedl anchored important parts of the Austrian line to the east. By the night of the 5th of July, Napoleon could draw on well over 150,000 men on and around the Marchfeld, while Charles had more than 130,000 in the main army and still hoped for Archduke John. More than 300,000 soldiers would ultimately be involved. The open plain gave commanders room to maneuver, but it also exposed troops to artillery whenever they crossed it. Napoleon had succeeded in bringing a huge army across the river. He now tried to finish the battle before Charles could fully exploit his defensive position. During the afternoon of the 5th of July, French pressure increased. Oudinot drove forward through the villages south of the Russbach. Devout pushed his troops toward the Austrian left. Massena extended the French position across a wide front. The army of Italy and the Saxons moved toward Wagram and Aderklaa. By evening, Napoleon ordered a larger attack. The timing looked promising. Austrian units had been fighting and moving for much of the day. The French were now deployed in strength. If Wagram and the heights beyond the Rustbach could be taken before night, Charles might be denied the chance to organize a second day. Instead, the attack began to lose coherence. Around Wagram, French, Italian, Saxon, and Austrian formations crowded into a limited area. Smoke from burning buildings and gunfire reduced visibility. Units approaching from different directions had difficulty identifying one another. In the confusion, Italian troops fired into Saxons, whose white uniforms could be mistaken for Austrian infantry. The Saxon formations recoiled, and their withdrawal disrupted troops moving behind them. At Bommersdorf, French attacks met stubborn resistance. Elsewhere, units that had advanced successfully found themselves unsupported or exposed to Austrian counterattacks. The assaults had not been coordinated tightly enough to produce a decisive breach before darkness. By the time the firing began to weaken, Wagram was still in Austrian hands. Napoleon had spent 6 weeks correcting the engineering failure that had contributed to Aspern-Essling. His army had crossed successfully and had reached the Austrian position in overwhelming numbers. Yet the first day had ended without a breakthrough. That night, exhausted soldiers from both armies slept close to the positions they would attack again in a few hours. Napoleon's plan for the 6th of July placed increasing importance on the right. Davout was to turn the Austrian left around Markgraf Neusiedl. If he succeeded, the French could begin rolling the Austrian line away from the Rustbach while the rest of the army fixed Charles in place. Charles had no intention of waiting for that attack. He planned to strike first. His concept depended on pressure across a wide front. Rosenberg would move against Davout on the French right. Other Austrian corps would press the center. On the opposite wing, Klenau and the forces near Aderklaa would attack the French left and push toward the Danube. If these movements developed together, Napoleon could be forced to defend several critical sectors before his own main attack gained momentum. The problem was distance. The Austrian formations were spread over a large area, and the orders reached different corps at different times. What had been designed as a coordinated blow began as a series of attacks. At about 4 a.m, Rosenberg moved first. His columns advanced against Davout and initially pushed back French outposts. Davout reacted quickly. Infantry divisions formed to meet the Austrian advance, while French cavalry moved against the mounted troops supporting Rosenberg. The fighting on this part of the field was serious. But the Austrian attack did not break Davout's corps. Before long, Rosenberg was being forced back toward the ground from which he had advanced. Farther west, however, the situation developed very differently. Aderklaa changed hands amid heavy fighting. Bernadotte's Saxons had already been badly shaken by the previous evening, and the French position around the village became unstable. Austrian pressure forced French troops back. Napoleon sent formations forward to restore the position. But the fighting continued to consume men without producing a secure result. The fighting around Aderklaa also exposed a command problem on the French side. Bernadotte's Saxons had been badly disordered, and the marshal pulled them back after losing the village. Napoleon was furious with the result and later removed him from command. For the men still fighting there, the immediate issue was simpler. The withdrawal opened ground that had to be filled before the Austrians could turn a local success into a wider break in the French line. Then the danger expanded south of Aderklaa. Klenau's corps advanced against the thin French left. Boudaide's division, left to protect the approaches toward the Danube, could not hold such a wide sector alone. Austrian troops pushed toward Aspern and Essling and began to threaten the French rear. For Napoleon, the geography was impossible to ignore. 6 weeks earlier, those villages had marked the limits of his failed bridgehead. Now Austrian soldiers were moving through the same area while the main French army was committed several kilometers to the north. Napoleon could not simply abandon his offensive on the right and pull the whole army backward. Doing so would surrender the initiative and give Charles time to stabilize the Rustbach line. Instead, he had to prevent the left from collapsing, while Davout continued the attack that had been planned before dawn. Masséna received the task. The marshal was suffering from a leg injury and moved in a carriage, but his corps had to make one of the most difficult movements of the battle. Divisions that had been facing north were redirected southward across the French front. They had to pass through an area exposed to Austrian artillery and cavalry while keeping enough order to fight once they reached the new position. As the movement began, Napoleon tried to protect it. Bessiers led cavalry against the Austrian formations around the center left. The attack did not break them, and Bessiers was wounded. French cavalry continued to operate in the open ground, forcing Austrian units to remain formed against mounted attack even when they wanted to advance. At the same time, a large concentration of French guns was assembled between Aderklaa and Brightonley. Under Lauriston, artillery from the Guard, the Army of Italy, and Allied formations opened against the Austrian center. Contemporary accounts differ over the exact number of pieces that ultimately fired together, but the concentration involved around 100 guns and became one of the defining features of the battle. The purpose was practical. The guns were not expected to destroy the entire Austrian army. They had to disrupt formations that might otherwise exploit Massena's movement and keep pressure on the Austrian center, while the French left was being rebuilt farther south. The cost to the artillerymen was severe. Austrian batteries answered effectively, and French guns were hit as they moved into position. Crews had to replace casualties while continuing to fire. Behind that screen of artillery, massed divisions kept moving. By around midday, they were approaching the Aspern sector and beginning to confront Klenau. The immediate crisis on the French left was being contained, but containing Klenau did not win Wagram. The decision was forming on the opposite side of the battlefield. Devout had resumed his offensive against the Austrian left. Markgraf Neusiedl was the key position in front of him. The village and the higher ground around it helped anchor Rosenberg's corps. A direct attack would be costly, so Devout combined pressure from the front with movements against the Austrian flank. His infantry advanced toward the village while cavalry operated farther east, threatening to turn the position. The fighting became prolonged. Austrian artillery fired from the heights. French battalions moved through open ground and around the village. Rosenberg attempted to hold long enough for developments elsewhere to favor Charles, but the morning's failed attack had already consumed time and strength. Gradually, the pressure became too great. French troops entered Markgraf Neusiedl and pushed beyond it. Austrian units began withdrawing from the position. Devout's cavalry moved against their exposed side, increasing the danger that the retreat could be cut off. Charles saw what was happening. Earlier in the morning, his right had driven toward Aspern, and his center had fought successfully around Aderklaa. Those gains had threatened Napoleon's communications, but they had not forced the French army to retreat. Masséna was now blocking Klenau. The French center still held, on Charles's left. Devout was breaking the position on which the eastern end of the Austrian line depended. The battle had changed direction. Napoleon now ordered pressure across the rest of the front. Oudinot attacked the Russbach position again. Eugen's Army of Italy filled the space created by Masséna's movement. Marmont moved forward as additional support. In the center, Napoleon gave MacDonald the task that would become the most famous attack of the battle. MacDonald assembled battered battalions from the Army of Italy into a dense formation and advanced toward the gap between Austrian forces around Sitzenbrunn. The exact strength of the attacking mass has been disputed, but thousands of men moved forward under concentrated artillery and musket fire. The Austrians could hardly miss. Round shot passed through the dense ranks. Austrian guns struck French artillery moving in support. Infantry fire increased as MacDonald's men came closer. The formation continued forward, but its front narrowed as casualties accumulated and units lost cohesion. French cavalry attacked on the flanks, though not always with the timing MacDonald needed. The Austrians adjusted their lines and poured fire into the advancing mass from several directions. Some accounts later reduced the number still standing in the core of the formation to only a fraction of those who had begun the advance. MacDonald did not smash the Austrian center in a single charge. He did something that was still important. His advance held Austrian attention in the center at the moment when Charles urgently needed freedom to respond to Devout. Austrian reserves could not be moved without risk. The pressure from MacDonald, Oudinot, Huguenet, and the French artillery made it increasingly difficult to repair the line that was already bending on the left. By early afternoon, Charles faced a choice that had become more dangerous with every hour. Archduke John was still approaching with additional troops. If he arrived in time, he might threaten the French right rear or provide a reserve for a renewed Austrian effort. But the reports reaching Charles showed that John would not appear soon enough to reverse the situation developing around Markgraf Neusiedl. The Austrian army was still organized. That was precisely why Charles chose to withdraw before it ceased to be organized. Orders were issued for a phased retreat. Klenau, who had advanced so far toward Aspern, began to pull back before Mastina. Bellegarde withdrew from the central sector. The troops around the Russbach gave ground as Devout and Udino continued pressing forward. The Austrian retreat was not a rout. Units covered one another and preserved enough cohesion to prevent Napoleon from turning victory into immediate destruction. The French were in poor condition to force the issue. Many formations had been marching and fighting for 2 days. Devout's corps had spent hours attacking defended ground. MacDonald's troops had suffered extreme losses in the center. Cavalry units had repeatedly charged and regrouped. The infantry on the left had crossed the battlefield under fire before fighting Klenau around Aspern. By late afternoon, the French had won the battle. But much of the army was too exhausted to mount the kind of pursuit that might have destroyed Charles's remaining forces. One of the last French casualties gave the end of the battle a more personal cost. General Antoine Lasalle, already one of the best-known light cavalry commanders in the army, was killed while leading cavalry against Klenau's retreating troops. His death came after the outcome was essentially decided. It did not change the result, but it showed how little separation there could be between victory and another name added to the casualty lists. At about 5 o'clock, Archduke John finally appeared near the battlefield. His arrival caused alarm among French troops that were already tired and disordered, but he quickly learned that the main Austrian army was withdrawing. His forces had arrived too late to change Wagram. There was an uncomfortable symmetry in what followed after Aspern-Essling. Charles had defeated Napoleon but had failed to pursue aggressively enough to destroy the French army on Lobau. That failure gave Napoleon 6 weeks to rebuild his crossing system and return. After Wagram, Napoleon had defeated Charles but could not immediately destroy the withdrawing Austrian army. The difference was what happened next. Charles continued his retreat north. Napoleon temporarily lost contact with him, then sent forces after the Austrians once their direction became clear. Fighting resumed around Znaim on the 10th of July and 11. This time, Austria did not receive another 6 weeks in which to prepare a new battle on the scale of Wagram. On the 12th of July, the fighting gave way to an armistice. Napoleon had not annihilated the Austrian army on the Marchfeld, but Wagram had changed the political position of the war. Austria had lost the battle it had prepared to fight with its main army, and further resistance now carried the risk of another major defeat without a clear prospect of reversing the campaign. The victory also transformed the careers of several French commanders. MacDonald, whose troops had advanced through the center under some of the heaviest fire of the battle, was elevated to marshal soon afterward. Oudinot, who had carried the fight against the Russbach position, received the same distinction. Marmont was also promoted. Within days of Wagram, Napoleon had created 3 new marshals from the campaign. For the men who survived Wagram, those honors did not change what had happened on the 5th of July -6. Wagram was a victory, but it was an expensive one. Austrian losses were reported at more than 41,000 men in some contemporary and later calculations, including roughly 23,000 killed or wounded, with the remainder missing or captured. French losses were around 37,500, including close to 10,000 missing or captured. The totals were therefore much closer than the final movement of the armies might suggest. French overall losses were only somewhat lower than those of the Austrians, while the number of French killed and wounded was at least comparable, and in some counts higher. The officer lists made the cost even clearer. Around 1,866 French officers appeared among the casualties, and more than 30 generals were killed or wounded. Yet none of those figures altered the strategic fact that mattered most to Napoleon. At Aspern-Essling, he had been forced back across the Danube. 6 weeks later, he returned, crossed the river with a system capable of supporting his army, defeated Charles on the Marchfeld, and pushed Austria toward an armistice. The Fifth Coalition's main continental campaign was collapsing for Napoleon and the men around him. Wagram could therefore be presented as another decisive success. The scale of the casualties did not have to disappear from the record. It simply did not have to change the meaning attached to the victory. As one admiring judgment put it, the emperor's achievement would not be diminished by the blood, tears, and suffering of the French soldiers who had paid for it.